Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts podcast. My name is Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. So last week I had a conversation with my friend Austin, and we discussed the question of why do people leave the church? And I really liked the conversation. I think it was a really great place to start and left a lot of questions, but I think as I started thinking about that question and that conversation, I started thinking, well, if we want to know why people are leaving the church, why don't we ask them? So this is sort of when I decided, okay, let's start having conversations with people who've deconstructed and left the church and understand their stories. Why did they do that? And where are they now as far as faith and spirituality? So today, for my first sort of deconstruction conversation, I have Sara Martin. I actually found Sara through the YouTube algorithm. She has her own channel, and her story really resonated with me. There was a lot in her story that was sort of similar to mine, and we both went sort of through this deconstruction phase and ended up in different spots. So it was lovely to have the conversation with her and sort of understand where she's coming from and how she came to the place where she is now. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you want to check out Sara, I have her link down below. But for now, here's our conversation. Sara, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's lovely to talk to you. So this is our first conversation ever. So it's kind of exciting to be able to sit and talk with you a little bit about your journey. So why don't you just give a little bit of introduction about yourself, and then we can get into it.
Sure. I am, it's weird to start off with I'm a cat mom, but I have 4 cats. I'm always like awkward with introductions, but I have cats. I am an administrative assistant by day, and in my free time, I like making YouTube videos and writing. I play piano, as you can see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything more specific you're looking for, but
No, that's great. Yeah. So the reason I reached out to you, the YouTube algorithm threw you in my line of vision, and I liked hearing some of your videos, and I thought your story was interesting. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about your journey with deconstruction and faith, and what that has sort of been for you, and why that led you to make YouTube videos in that realm.
yeah, it's been a wild ride.
Yeah.
There've been a lot of people lately finding me through the YouTube algorithm. It was kind of out of nowhere. Kind of like woke up one morning like, holy crap, where did all these people come from? I wasn't expecting that. But yeah, I have been going through just kind of like a period of questioning the beliefs I've held since I was a kid, just for the past few years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a wild ride. It's extremely challenging to question things that you have kind of believed your entire life.
Right.
And just like going through it, I didn't necessarily feel like I knew of anyone else kind of questioning. I mean, as a Christian and being surrounded by other Christian friends and people at church, like there's a certain amount of questioning, like, oh, what does this mean in the Bible, or like theological things. But I just felt like my questioning was like maybe a step beyond what was considered acceptable.
Like borderline heretical.
Right. Yeah. So I kind of just kept it to myself, and I felt really alone, and especially, kind of feeling heretical. Like, I don't know if I should be asking this stuff. Like, what is God thinking of me? I didn't feel comfortable asking anyone else like their thoughts on what I was going through.
Right. And what kind of background was it? Because it was Christian, but was it what sort of flavor?
Kind of a hodgepodge of flavors. Growing up, my parents didn't go to church, but my grandparents did, so I went with them. And they went to, well, I think it was like a missionary church denomination, is what it technically is. It's kind of a little tiny denomination, but it's considered evangelical. They put a big emphasis on the Bible, and obviously like going on mission trips and things like that, and sharing the gospel with the world and that sort of stuff. when I got older, I went to a pretty big, like, non-denominational church with my mom, very contemporary. Having electric guitars and drums in church was new for me, and I enjoyed that though. So I went there for a while, and then I went to a Free Methodist college with people from all different faith backgrounds and denominations. So kind of a mix of different things, but it was all within the realm of like evangelical kind of teaching.
Right.
So
Okay. And so when for you did these questions start feeling, well, when did the questions start coming up? And then when did they start feeling uncomfortable to be asking them within like the walls and the environment of what would be sort of this evangelical Christian space?
yeah, I would say it was not too long after graduating college. I was always irritated at how people would call our university like a Christian bubble. Like, oh, it's not really a bubble, but yeah, I left the bubble and there was reality, and
Yep.
all of the questions kind of exploded. Um, I kind of just had like some mixed experiences that made me question, like, well, maybe I don't have this God thing right. Like maybe I'm approaching this wrong. And I talked about this in my one YouTube video where I kind of break down the process of like sort of how my deconstruction progressed. But I think it sounds kind of ridiculous, but one of the first things after graduating was getting my first job, like my first adult job. And it was something that I had prayed a lot about. I kind of did all the things that I had been taught in college and growing up that you're supposed to do. Like, oh, well, God has a plan for you. And, if you just pray and seek Him and follow Him to the best of your ability, He'll direct you to where you want you to go. And so I really felt like doors had opened up for me to get this particular job working at like a mental health hospital. And like, there's nothing wrong with like the job itself, but for me, it just was not a good fit. It was like a 12-hour shift multiple times a week. And for someone that had not worked at all before, like that was like very overwhelming. Like,
Right.
wow, it's a long day. Um, Definitely kudos to people that can go right from college to that kind of a schedule. But that was overwhelming. And I don't know, it's just, I would compare it to just like going to a store and trying on a pair of clothes. It's just like, oh, this does not feel right. Like, I know
Yeah.
this isn't for me. So it really just kind of had like that sensation. Like, I don't think this is good for me.
Right.
And,
Well, to work in mental health is just a whole nother level. What
right.
all of the structures and the people and like the emotions of what it is, it's unbelievable. So to get thrown into that 12 hours a day all the time, it's a culture shock.
Right. Yeah, it was crazy. And I do have my bachelor's degree in psychology, so I thought this is perfect. This makes sense. Mental health house hospital and psychology degree, like this should work out. But I mean that doesn't mean like any job that fits within that realm is going to be a good fit.
Right.
Um Especially just like it was more like dealing with addiction and substance abuse and that sort of stuff, which is something I'm not super familiar with.
Right.
So that was another thing, like, I don't know. Um, yeah, just it was a crazy first day. But after after I survived that day, I just like I know jobs are scary when you first start and there's a lot to learn, but this just felt like I don't I don't know that I want to go back to this. Like,
Right.
so I didn't. That was my first and last day. And I mean, that was hard enough just to call my supervisor and say, "Hey, I'm not coming back." Like that
Yeah.
was embarrassing enough, but then also to have like the faith component thrown into it. Like, what? just happened. Like,
Right. And how do you see those two things playing on each other? This sort of culture clash with this job and what's going on here, and then, this thing that's going on with your faith.
I mean, having both of those combined was just over the top, like trying to sort that out. Because on one hand, it's like, okay, I'm back to square one of trying to find a job. And then on the other hand, it's like, well, can I trust God to help me with that? Like, I
Mm,
thought he did with getting me this job, but that didn't work out. So, like, is God really involved in our lives to that degree? Is
mm,
it more just up to me to, make those decisions? Because I had always thought, like, yes, God is involved that, personally in your life, every decision, really, he
mhm.
wants to be involved in. And so, yeah, that's that's what really got me questioning that. Like, what can I trust God to give me direction in, and what's kind of my responsibility?
Right.
So,
So where did it go from there? So you've probably already started having some questions, some doubts, and then this hits, and now you've lost sort of sight of where's my anchor? How do I know if God's in these things? How did it evolve from there?
well, at the same time, I was in a relationship with someone that I had been dating in college, and it was sort of the same situation. I felt like God had confirmed to both of us that, like, we were supposed to be together, like, this is what
Yeah.
he wanted, and it just was kind of falling apart at that point. Like, we were long distance and nothing was really changing, and we'd been dating for a couple of years and wanted to, like, move on with life together. Um, but again, it was a situation of like, well, God's just not opening any doors for, one of us to relocate or something. It was just this big spiritual problem, really.
Mhm.
And being a new college graduate, again, trying to like figure out job wise, like, okay, where do I look? Do I keep looking in my area? Do I look where he is? Um, it was just a lot, and my mental health was just really suffering at that point, with everything going on. So I decided that I needed to break off that relationship for my own sanity, really.
Yeah.
Um, and just that having the job not work out and all of the theological questions that came up with that, and then the relationship with my boyfriend not working out, like both of these things that I thought were like divinely orchestrated just falling apart. It's like, okay, I
Yeah.
don't know what's happening anymore.
Yeah.
Like, I literally don't know how to make sense of this. And so, um even though in some ways, like, I finally felt like I could breathe and plan my life knowing that I wasn't going to try to, mold it around getting this other person to be part of it. um I think just like all of the questioning and realizing that I had some stuff to figure out faith wise, it was just a lot. And so I started feeling depressed, honestly. And that lasted for a number of months. And I just, because it's not as simple as just, oh, well, who's God? When you believe that deeply, like God was my whole identity, it was my whole world, my whole life. And so to be asking questions about my faith meant asking questions about me and who am I and all of those really hard things to have to work through. And
Yeah.
yeah, it was just really intense.
Yeah. I mean, and I can definitely resonate with that because when I was going through my own deconstruction, I was dating long distance. In fact, we were engaged, and at a certain point, my mental health was just so deteriorated that I was like, I need to like, and we just couldn't get on the same page of where we're supposed to be and what we're gonna do. So it's like, I need to stop this. I need to figure out God and figure out all these things, and then somewhere down the line, we'll figure it out. And we never did. But it's so it's so devastating and hard to comprehend when things like that, when you think, oh, this is where God has called me or what God wants, where you start questioning, well, where is he in this? And is he involved at all? Or was I wrong? And there's all of these questions that you start pondering, and uh, it, it creates just an even deeper, more um, turbulent dynamic, because it's not just thinking about ideas and theology. It's like, this is my life. this is
Mm-hmm.
this is who I am and what I've always believed, and how do I make sense of it?
Yeah. Yeah. And it literally affects everything.
Yeah.
It's not just, oh, what do I believe when I walk into church on Sunday? It's, what do I do on a daily basis? Like if I'm trying to plan my future and plan my life,
Right.
it, yeah, it affects everything.
I think it's really different when, you're talking about when you genuinely believe something and have lived your life to like embed that in the way that you live outside of, going to church every Sunday. Because there's obviously a certain level of cultural religious practice where it's like, oh, I go to church every Sunday and I'm a Christian because that's what I grew up with and whatever. It's a whole different thing to say, I believe this and I spend my time integrating that into my life. And then all of a sudden you start questioning, um, is this thing that I've integrated true?
Yeah.
It's a totally different whirlwind.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like questioning the foundation of everything. It's like, well, wait, I'm trying to build walls and a second floor at this point, and now I've got to go back and like reevaluate what I'm building on to begin with.
Right. So, you broke up the relationship. You're kind of going through this depression cycle. Are you still in churches? Are you still like claiming God, pursuing God, or has it sort of started severing at that point?
At that point, I still was definitely open to God. I still considered myself to be a follower of Jesus. I just was very confused about what that was supposed to look like. Um, and it was at that point that I started feeling very alone. I
Mm,
I could still talk with my friends about, feeling depressed and dealing with that, but um there came a point where it just felt like that my questions were too much. Um and so I kind of just kept it to myself. Um I was able to connect with someone. I'm trying to remember how I met him, but I think it was looking up one of his books on Amazon. His name's Steve Austin. He became my life coach, but one of his books was From Pastor to a Psych Ward. And it was his story of how um, he was a pastor, Christian, believed everything genuinely, but inside was dealing with just a lot of darkness and depression and mental illness. And so um, finding his story was really helpful because it was kind of like a connection, like, oh, okay, there are other people out there dealing with things that don't quite match up with this Christian narrative that I've been living by. And it's not to say that I expected life to be perfect. Like, by no means did I expect everything to be easy just because I was a Christian. Like,
right.
I was not naive like that. But it's one thing to go through hard times externally, I mean internally too, but it's another to be questioning God himself. Like
Mm,
like there wasn't God to lean on because I didn't know who he was.
right.
So through finding that book though, I connected with Steve and we started working together. He was the one that introduced me to the whole concept of deconstruction. And just to have a name for it and to know that I wasn't alone was so helpful for me. Like it
Mm,
didn't fix what I was going through, but it gave me permission to ask questions and be able to say things out loud. Like, I don't believe that God has this perfect plan for every person that we're supposed to live by. And I don't believe, whatever it is, just to be able to have permission to say those kinds of things and question it and have a space to do that was really important. Um, and from there, I got plugged into other like Facebook groups of people going through similar things. Again, just knowing I wasn't alone in it was so helpful.
Yeah. So at what point did you feel that it was time for you to sort of break away from the identity of Christian? And I'm not even sure what you identify with now, but like where did that sort of break come, and how did it sort of um, evolve as it like sort of manifested in your life?
Yeah, that kind of happened over the course of maybe a year or two. Um, I worked with Steve for, it might have been like 6 months or so. Um, and then from there, kind of kept working through things on my own. Um, and it was kind of just like a slow progression and slow realization. I think also, like, at the same time, I'm not just working out like what I believe, but it's also I'm working out a new identity and figuring out who I am. If God isn't at the heart of it anymore, or his role has changed, then what does that look like for me? And so I started to build an identity for myself that wasn't primarily based on Jesus and the faith that I had growing up. I started figuring out who I was on my own. And um, I think just over time, as I let myself ask questions and kind of just go where I ended up, like, I just realized, like, I don't know if I identify with this label of Christian anymore. At
Mhm.
least not any definition of it that I knew. Um, I don't have like solid answers for who Jesus is. I don't know if he like was resurrected or not. Like, but I don't feel this pressure to have to pin down for sure like what I believe on that.
Mm.
I would say it was probably a year ago that I kind of just realized one day that I don't think I'm a Christian anymore. Um, and I didn't feel like I needed to hang on to that label, which to even get to a point where I felt like I'm not a Christian at this point. Like, I if you would have told me like 5 years ago, 10 years ago that I would ever say that in my lifetime, I would have just laughed. Like, this
Right.
this isn't supposed to happen to me.
Right.
But yeah, it happened. And I kind of realized too that maybe one of the only reasons I still was like hesitating to face that shift in my faith was primarily based on fear.
Mm.
Fear of being wrong, fear of hell, fear of whatever it might be. And that just kind of was sad to me to realize that if the primary reason I'm holding on to this label is because of fear, like, that's not a good reason.
Yeah,
That's
probably
not,
the wrong reason.
yeah, that's not healthy. That's not okay. And like someone the other day posted a comment on my video and was like, what will set you straight is if you just search on YouTube for videos of hell testimonies. That'll fix. I'm like, that is fear. Like, no, I am not
Mm.
going to change my beliefs and like go back to believing something because of fear.
Mm.
That's not the kind of person I want to be. That's not the kind of life I want to live, and that's not the kind of faith I want to follow.
Right.
So yeah, it was probably like a year ago or so that I kind of realized maybe I don't need to call myself a Christian anymore. And I wasn't struck by lightning or anything when I finally admitted it to myself.
Hmm. So I wanted to ask you, when you got to that place, you stopped identifying as a Christian. How was that accepted by family, friends, people in your life? What reaction did you get from, being open and sort of being in a place where you can say that?
I've been pretty selective about who I share that with.
Mm,
Even before I came to the realization that I don't consider myself a Christian anymore, I was still very private about it
mm,
because fear of judgment
mm,
is very real. And having gone to a Christian university, my friends are all still very much Christians. And so I was really nervous about sharing with them, even as I was going through like that period of questioning and starting to initially doubt things. Um, I would share to a point, but shut down when I felt like it was getting too too risky, that I might
mm.
jeopardize our friendships, because Jesus was such a huge part of our friendships. Like, we had Bible studies together, we
Right.
prayed together. It was a huge part of our friendship. So I didn't know if I didn't have that to share with them anymore, if those relationships would still be around. Um, I have since then shared with two of them, of my friend group, about where I'm at. I don't know that I've like straight out said, yeah, I'm not a Christian anymore. But I've definitely I've definitely opened up to a point where it felt scary and I wasn't sure how they were going to react. Um, but thankfully, they were both very understanding. And one of them is also deconstructing, come to
Mm.
find out. Like, hi, I will be your friend. I'll help you through this. Like, this is great.
Yeah.
But as far as my friends go, it was just really reassuring, um, with the few that I did share, that it wasn't something that, was going to jeopardize our friendships.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, and that's a very common theme that I've seen a lot of people who deconstruct. They sort of go isolate themselves, do it on their own. They don't feel like they can ask those questions in church. And I'm always left with the question, is this a perceived pressure that we can't talk about these things and ask these questions, or is it something based in reality? And I'm sure it probably depends on the church and the kind of group of people, but there is this interesting dynamic where there's this wall where you can ask a certain question at a certain point, and there's a level at which we can't ask or push too much, because then there's a certain level of status that's lost within the group and the community, and it becomes yeah, it becomes really tricky to navigate those things. And I've definitely felt those pressures a little bit, although I'm very unbothered by what people think about me. So I'm I'm more likely to ask the questions even if it does get me in trouble.
I wish I was more like that.
it
But
gets it
it,
gets me in tricky situations. I should probably be less that way, but
yeah, there's pros and cons, but yeah.
yeah. But and something I want to ask you too. So you're married, and your husband, he still identifies as Christian. Is that correct?
Yep.
How has that been for you? If you want to talk about that, like, has it? I think that for a lot of people, it's hard to do that, especially if you're on two different levels. One's deconstructing, one's not. Has that been a difficulty for you? Was it hard to share those things with him?
Surprisingly, it's been okay. Um, when I first met him, ironically, we met on Christian Mingle. So, when I went into signing up for Christian Mingle, I thought, like, okay, I'm gonna meet this kind of person. They're gonna be just like me. Like, this is
Mm,
this is what having real faith in Jesus looks like. And so I expected to meet somebody that had the exact same views as I did. That was not the case. Like, he was raised Catholic, totally different background, and faith just means something different to him. Like, I would honestly say he's probably more agnostic than anything, but like it doesn't matter to him. Like, he goes to church, he volunteers, he gets what he needs to from it, and like that's just how it is. And when we first started dating, when I realized that he had a very different view of faith, I was kind of freaked out. Like, am I allowed to date somebody like this? Like, he's never done a devotional in his life. He's not like, he doesn't read the Bible. Like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Um, because it was so different from everything I had been taught, like all of this advice and stuff I had learned about Christian dating. Like, he just didn't fit that definition of what it was supposed to look like. But I, at that point, was questioning and already deconstructing. That was after um, that period of feeling depressed and moving through that. Um, so by the time I met him, I was like, I'm ready to try something new. Like, it doesn't have to fit within this box that I've been told it needs to. So he's always kind of had a different view of what it means to be a Christian than I have, which turned out to be a really good thing. Because at the beginning, I was like, I don't know, this is right. But now it's just been funny how I was like the super hardcore, like Jesus loving person at the beginning. And now it's like, I don't know if I'm a Christian anymore. And I'm going to make videos about it on YouTube.
Yeah.
So he's very supportive. I think he would like it if I still had like some interest in like going to church or something, but he totally respects just where I'm at, and that's not something that I need in my life right now.
Right. And it's amazing to have that support, especially with the person who, is your partner. And I think I'm part of a online community that explores like religion and philosophy, all this stuff, and it's based off of a YouTuber, Paul Vanderklay. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's this Christian reform minister in California who does commentary videos on Jordan Peterson and like other cultural things. And I've been asked to do like a marriage series on his channel. And we've been talking about that. And I've sort of been, talking about, okay, I grew up in this purity culture, evangelical view of Christianity and what it looks like. And I think just through getting older and going through what I did with, broken engagements and trying to refocus of what that means, um, gain this whole perspective of like, what does it mean to be a Christian and what does it mean to operate well in those things? And, how do we get past this sort of self-identification to like honest religious pursuit and practice? Those two things are very different. And so, yeah, it totally resonates with me what you're saying about, this idea of it's very different from this box that you were sold. Like, this is what a Christian is and how it's supposed to be perceived to, what you're seeing from your husband and the person that you've, tied your life to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It turns out your faith doesn't have to be like the biggest part of your relationship. Like, if you don't want it to be, if that's important to you, totally fine. But it doesn't have to be.
Mm. So what got you to the place where you decided, okay, I want to start putting this stuff out online. I want to create videos and, see what comes of it.
It kind of started with blogging when I was initially starting to question things after I graduated college. I had started a blog where I just wrote and processed what I was going through.
Mm.
Eventually, I stopped writing for that blog when I didn't feel like I could be open anymore. Because at that point, I had shared it with family members and people from church. So I knew they were reading it. and I eventually didn't feel safe to write there anymore. So I shut down that blog, but I kept writing, and eventually started my new blog, um, where I kept writing, and that kind of transitioned into, well, maybe I should try posting a video about it. Um, in my own like personal life, I've always loved journaling, and I used to like have actual journals that I would write in,
Mm.
but then that took too long, so I switched to typing. And then that took too long, so that switched to just like doing video snippets of just kind of like talking to myself. So I'm like, well, if I can do this, I can I can share some of this. Like some of this is actually not that bad. So um yeah, I posted a couple of them on YouTube and didn't expect anything to happen with them. They were mostly just me rambling about adult struggles and things.
Mm.
But um, as far as like sharing about deconstruction, that really was just motivated by how alone I felt when I first started going through it. Um, I just thought, like, if there's any way that this could help somebody else feel like they're not alone, then I absolutely want to share and affirm whoever might find it. So that's really what prompted me to want to start making videos. I never expected it to like turn into anything really. Um, but what I'm glad like of all my videos that the YouTube algorithm has picked up for some reason, I'm glad that it's the one about my deconstruction process. Because I wanted to make something that yes would affirm other people that it's okay to go through things like that and ask questions and doubt. But I also like wanted to just kind of make it for people that may still be Christians that don't understand like what that's like.
Mm.
Not that I was expecting to like change everybody's minds like, oh, this is totally fine. Like I know that it's kind of like we said a heretical thing, like
Mm.
but to be able to like break down my story into like a step by step video and explain how I got from like devoted Jesus follower to not sure what I believe anymore at all. I
Right.
don't know that I'm really a Christian. Like I thought that would be helpful for other people to kind of just see it doesn't happen overnight. It's not just because I want to go out and sin and party and all of that. Like
Right.
this is how it can happen. This is what it can look like.
Right.
So that's sort of the backstory of how I started posting on YouTube.
Well, and it makes a lot of sense. You know, I'm still a Christian, although my belief is vastly different than what I grew up with and how I have seen it before. But I've seen some of these, especially in evangelical circles, the caricatures of what it is of why people leave the faith or how to combat that. And some of these things, I'm like, it's so much more nuanced than that. There's so much more going on. And I think when you've gone through a deconstruction process, there's a part of you that understands, even if you never leave a faith, if you stay with your religion or find a different one, there's something to that understanding of the process of doing that and the necessity to do that to even have a fighting chance of having an honest, authentic faith and having clarity of not just what you believe, but the why behind it and if that is legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of want to talk to you too about this idea of reconstruction, and it kind of came up sort of in my YouTube comments. I've had a couple people. I've been talking a little bit about deconstruction, and I've had a couple people talking about, there's a lot of this talk about deconstruction, but there's not a lot of sort of emphasis on this reconstruction of rebuilding the things that you took apart. And in my estimation, I think there's a place for both, and you can do both of them well and both of them poorly, just depending on how you're operating within that. But how do you feel about, reconstruction, and where do you think you are in that process? You feel like you're still deconstructing and taking apart the things you used to know, or are you kind of at a place where you're wanting to rebuild or have started to rebuild into something new?
I think that reconstruction can be a good thing as long as it's coming from a healthy place. I
Mm,
think if you feel pressured into rebuilding something like, oh, I got rid of all of this stuff, well now I have to build something in its place. Like
right.
I don't think it should be something you feel obligated to do. And for me personally, I've never like intentionally focused on, okay, what am I replacing this with? What am I
Mm,
building? It's just I'm going to be true to myself. I'm going to be authentic with myself, and I'm just going to respect the process, however long it takes, whatever it looks like. And so I think naturally as I've like worked through some of the negative things of what I believed and the worldview that I'm coming out of, I think naturally it does get replaced with better things and healthier things and more positive things, whether you realize it or not.
mm,
It bothers me though that it seems like there are people that still are within Christian circles that feel like, okay, you have to reconstruct, like you have to rebuild something, and it's not even Christians necessarily. I've seen a lot of atheists in my comments too saying
mm.
like, okay, you don't believe all of these things anymore. Well, what do you believe? Like, what do you believe? I'm like, what does it matter? Like, why? You guys seem more bothered by the fact that I haven't come out and said what I believe now than I am. Like I am totally okay. Like all of my life I was dependent on this need to have certainty, and that's something that my Christian faith provided, was certain answers to a lot of things, even if the answer was, God works in mysterious ways. Like that was still some level of certainty.
Mm,
But now I feel like I've worked really hard to let go of the fact that life is uncertain in a lot of ways,
mm.
and that's okay. And so I don't feel this need to be able to make a PowerPoint presentation of this is what I now believe. Like
Right.
I don't feel like that.
Right. And I think that's for me some of the problems that I've seen what's happening in this space when people, leave and break things down. All of a sudden it's becomes this other sort of vigor to then, okay, well, this, and rebuilding something with the same sort of blind confidence that they did with whatever faith that they had.
Hmm.
And, at one point, it's like deconstruction's a part of for some people is a part of a journey of genuinely understanding the world and getting a place to honesty and truth. um, I think for myself, I personally found that the continual deconstruction and pulling apart um, has a high potential to eventually lead to insanity, depression, a lot of negative emotional things. And there's a place and a time to reconstruct, but it's not on this timeline where, it's the same for everybody. And I
Right.
think there's people in different spaces and different places. And I think there's some beauty in reconstructing. I think it just I think it really matters what you mean by that word. Is
Hmm.
reconstructing meaning, coming back to something, or just building something up so that you have something to stand for? Or is it, this um, sort of way to help rebuild and reorganize the categories that are all shattered to give you a little bit more um, clarity in the way that you're moving forward and like sort of repair some of the cracks in the lens that you've had? Um, it's a really tricky business.
Hmm. That's what I love about the whole concept of deconstruction, reconstruction, though, is that it is so individualized. Like
Mm,
my story is going to look a lot different from yours, and it's going to look a lot different from anybody else that goes through this. And I
Mm.
think it's awesome that, I might have ended up in a place where I don't feel like I need to call myself a Christian anymore, but yet like you can still call yourself a Christian, or, someone might end up in a totally different place. Like I love that there are no rules to where you have to end up.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you can definitely see a lot of patterns and themes that are going through and tracking through a lot of these stories, and you can gain a lot of wisdom in them. But the patterns in themselves don't tell you the whole picture. There's so much more complication, and I think human beings are so experiential and emotional, and there's a whole life that no matter how much you tell, like there's all these little things that are never going to give the full picture. And how do we best do our best in the little glimpses that we get, use that in our own lives to make sense of the world and how we should act in it. It's yeah, I think it's something to aspire to. But there's there's a lot of mistakes along the way, I'm sure,
Yeah,
to try to figure out how to do that better. Because I don't think in our culture or in us as human beings do we do that naturally.
right.
Mm. Well, I've
Yeah.
been asking you a lot of questions. Do you have any questions for me?
I mean, I always love like just hearing more about people's stories.
Mm,
That's something else I was gonna say about just deconstruction in general. Like I love that I don't have like these walls that I've tried to build up since deconstructing, um, because I just feel like for the first time in my life, I'm open to just listening to people.
mm,
I don't have to try to fit their story and like my particular worldview, like
mm,
my understanding. I don't have to fit it in this Christian box. I get to just listen to stories and it
right.
doesn't matter. Like I
Mm,
can be judgment free. And it I love that.
yeah.
I'm all about listening to other people's stories. But yeah, if there was anything I had questions about, it would just be more of like your story. And I mean, I know we probably don't have like time to just go into like your whole life story, but
No,
I
it's fine. I have control of this. We can do whatever we want. If this is 2 hours, it's 2 hours. And I promise you, there's some of my listeners, if they're interested, they'll listen for 2 hours. I know that. um, but yeah, so I've shared this on my channel a little bit, and I continue to sort of try to find ways to keep sharing it and resharing it as I um, sort of dig into ideas. But I grew up non-denominational Christian, and probably came to it in a real sense when I was 18. I think I always believed it, and that idea of God never bothered me. But 18 was sort of when I had this sort of experience. I got into this little car accident, and it sort of shook me up and realized, oh, I'm claiming all of these things, but I'm not living the way that I'm say I should like believe. And that was a problem for me. So I was like, okay, I can keep doing this and sort of feel unfulfilled. I can go off and do whatever I want. But I just seen enough people in my life who'd gone down those roads, and it was like, that doesn't look fulfilling either. So let me just give this whole religious thing a shot, live the way I say I believe, and see if it changes me. And within 6 months, I was just this whole different person. And it wasn't like I had done very many different behavioral changes. I was already going to church all the time. I wasn't, doing anything that would be like obviously sinful. And I just kept doing those things, but the intention of how I was doing them changed. And I saw the way that it changed my life and how I lived and how I saw the world. I became a much more interested person in life and exploration, a much more forgiving person, a lot less bitter and depressed. And so I was like, wow, okay. And so I spent 2 years sort of living that life of like, okay, I'm going to pursue truth, which in my estimation was God, right? So I'm doing that. And then I go off to college and I moved to the Bay Area, which is very outside. I grew up in this sort of conservative Christian bubble in Arizona, to the Bay Area, which is in so many ways the exact opposite, very liberal. not very religious. And at that point, I consciously stopped going to church, not because I didn't believe in God, but I just realized, hey, I've spent my whole life in this building and with these people who call themselves a church, but I don't really know what it means to be the church outside of it. So I'm going to try. So I just would have conversations with people about religion outside of my faith and, have these really beautiful conversations. And it was really helpful. And like I was growing. And so I did that for 2 years in the Bay Area. And then I went to Australia to uh, go study abroad. And that's when I started meeting, these militant atheists. Um, got into these conversations, eventually read Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And there was a lot of that in there where I didn't agree with his conclusions or everything he said, but there was a lot of truth that I did see in it. And there was things that I agreed with. And I think it was the first time where I could understand why someone would not be a Christian or believe in God. Not even just be a Christian, like why someone would not believe in God. Because before that, I didn't really even have a concept. And then around maybe a month after I finished that book, the 2016 presidential election happened. And I think when I saw that Trump got elected, it was sort of the first time I realized I was accepting things as true without questioning it. Because it was like, we were told time and time again that Trump could not be president, yet here he is. And what else am I believing that um, I've just not really followed through? And yeah, it definitely led into like existential crises and sort of a lot of questioning and deconstruction. And at a certain point, like there was some that was good where it was like, okay, now I'm open and I'm talking and I'm willing to look at this stuff. But then eventually it became uh, sort of destructive where I became very addicted to the consumption of information, and it led to overextending myself and in manic episodes, and eventually deteriorated so much that I had a manic episode that literally felt like an LSD trip. Never done drugs in my life, just from what I've heard from people who do drugs. You're seeing colors, you have no track of time. So I eventually checked myself into a mental hospital. And, it just got so like I just deteriorated so much to the point where it was like all I had to hold on to was God, like nothing else. And like when I finally got to that point, um, that was sort of when I started gaining my sanity back. But I was still sort of shook by the experience and what it is. And um, there was a lot of it that was very spiritual. You talk about LSD trips being spiritual. I'm like, whatever is happening to me, there's something here that feels more than just like my brain breaking. There's something very spiritual, and I don't get it. I don't know, and I don't even like saying it because it just sounds so uh uh I don't know, mystical. I don't like being seen as a mystic, but I believe in a mystical religion. What can I do? I'm stuck with that burden. So after that point, I kind of got to the place where it was like, okay, I'm sort of left here with all these pieces falling apart. And then eventually I'd gotten engaged that December, and then it was like April, and my fiance came over and my family came over, and eventually they were trying to get me to come back to America. And I was like, no, I don't think I'm supposed to be there. I'm supposed to be here. I need to be here. And my fiance was sort of like, okay, well, like I can't come. He's gonna move to Australia with and be with me. And he was like, well, I can't come. And then I was like, well, like, I don't know. I just felt like God saying, like, then you got to let him go. And so I was like, then I can't do this. And so, and then there's a whole nother story of sort of this like weird experience that I had after, giving up the thing, in my estimation, the thing that was my everything, the thing that I was supposed to do, everything that I wanted, and being willing to like sacrifice that because I felt like God was asking me to. Um, yeah, it was just this weird peace within this like crisis where it's like, I should be like, there's a sense where I should be so devastated and so confused, yet there's something about a peace in there because even though everything has fallen apart, I constantly pursued God and tried to do the right things. So all of that happens. My life is like collapsed around me. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to let the dust settle and then I'm going to reevaluate. So I sort of went through this process of trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we come to truth? Starting, and I had a whole, I had a whole system. Like I'm going to start with philosophy and then get to the point if I can believe atheism. And then from there, I'll start looking at religions. And long story short, I came back to Christianity. I felt um, through my research and through what I had done, I felt confident enough that I didn't have all the answers, but I did feel like Christianity was true. And so I sort of fell into this default Protestantism where I jumped around to a couple denominations, especially when I was in Australia. But when I finally moved back to Phoenix, I found myself in a little evangelical church and one that was sort of aimed towards college kids. And for me, that was huge because, like, hey, I went through deconstruction and I did it in college. And if I had some support to do that, I feel like it would have been a whole lot easier. So I want to be in a church where I have the opportunity to do that and allow people to have some support if they're questioning or they're trying to find what's true. And so that was sort of my thing. But after being out of the church for so long and then coming back in, it felt like it felt like I had gone through the looking glass where it's like I remember all of this, but now it all feels a little off to me, and it's not like there's a struggle within me to embrace it the way that I did when I was younger. But I was there for about 2 years, 2.5 years, just sort of slugging it out. And then eventually I got to the point I went and visited a church in Portland. And when I went to that service, it was the first time I realized I had gone to a church service and not been bothered by everything around me. And it was like this feeling of um, like treading water and then realizing you're in the shallow end and you can stand up and breathe. And I was like, oh, I think this evangelical Protestant thing is eating me up a little more than I thought. And so I wasn't immediately like, okay, I'm done. I'm not going here anymore. It's like, I'm staying here because I think when it comes to religion and it comes to church, a lot of it is about embracing uncomfortability and understanding that truth is not always the what I like it to be. And so it was like, I'm going to try to embrace that, but I'm going to be open to something different. I'm going to be open to some different church if it presents itself. And right around that time, I started meeting a lot of Orthodox Christian people. I had some filmmaker friends and then some friends within this online community that I was with. And I started realizing I know nothing about Orthodox Christianity. I know a lot about Protestantism. I know a little bit about Catholicism. And there was just some theology things that didn't quite sit right with me. So it was never something that I could adopt for myself. But Eastern Orthodoxy, no clue. And I'd gotten into some conversations and then eventually someone just suggested, well, just go to service. And so I was like, okay. So I go to a service and um, it was an experience outside anything that I'd ever had. I always sort of compare it to the story in Elijah where he goes up to the mountain and there's fire and wind and earthquakes. And then there's this whisper and God is in the whisper. And for me, that's what orthodoxy was. It was this like quiet whisper. And it was something where it was like, I grew up in non-denominational churches where, you have the guitars and smoke machines and what have you. And so like this high church thing never like resonated with me. I didn't get it. But I go to this service and I'm like, I don't know what they're doing, but it means something and I want to know. And I'm just like enamored by being in this place. And then I have a conversation with the priest, and I don't even remember everything we talked about, but the questions that I had when he answered them, I was like, oh, okay. I was just left without this sort of skepticism and these like questions. And I was like, okay, I don't know what this is, but I want to know more. And I no longer feel confident in calling myself Protestant. And I've been exploring Orthodoxy ever since. And I mean, there's a whole lot more to all of that story. It's very interesting, but I'm not officially converting yet, but I'm very seriously considering it. And it's been pretty crazy how different the life and the faith of Orthodoxy and the way that they understand truth and the way that they interpret theology is so different to the Protestantism that I grew up with, yet answers the questions in such a fuller way than I've ever seen anywhere else. So I'm still poking and prodding and doing my due diligence. But the lovely thing about the Orthodox Church is this sort of seeker sensitive attitude that they have, where, it's like the church is always here. If you want to learn about who we are and what we are, we're open. We'll answer any questions, but feel free to go anywhere else and ask the questions you need to, because, the church is always here. And so it definitely makes it easier to do the poking and the prodding and asking the questions. But it's been an interesting journey. It's been a wild ride, when you say it's a roller coaster. And that was something, this is what I do remember about my first conversation with my priest. I went to a Saturday night Vesper service. And so he's like, oh, do you usually go to Vespers? I don't even know what that word was. I'm like, what? He's like, do you usually go to the Vesper service? I'm like, oh no, this is my first Orthodox service ever. And he's like, oh, it must have been quite the journey to get here. And I'm like, that it was. But yeah, so it's just been interesting. But I think through all of it, it's been cool, because I mean, my deconstruction, I never lost faith. I think there's times where you could say I got close. I think I was more like, I want to know what's true, independent if I like it or not. I want Christianity to be true. But if it's not true, I want to know, because I'd rather align myself with the thing that is. And there's sort of a relief to say, oh, I don't think I could be an atheist, because I don't find the arguments compelling or coherent in a lot of ways when I really dig into them. But I think for a while, for me, there was a lot of questioning of myself, because like, is this just confirmation bias? Am I trying to um reaffirm this thing? And so it's been a lot of journey of you know going not only through ideas, but the emotions attached to those ideas, and all of the personal things that I went through. It gave me a lot of place to question, like, where is God, and how is my understanding off with him in the ways that I am operating with this, because something's not aligning up. And I want the answers. So yeah, I don't know, that was a lot. I don't know if that was
No, that's
helpful.
so awesome. I love just hearing like what it looks like for other people. And I think it's so cool that like you've been able to like explore a totally different branch of Christianity and find like whole new meaning there. Like I think that's so cool.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think so. Both of my roommates are Protestants, and I went with them to the church that I did before I moved to Orthodoxy, and they don't care that I'm. I don't think they know enough about Orthodoxy to even know if they should be like freaked out about it or not. But I went to a Protestant service with them. Maybe like 2 or 3 months ago, and it was the first time where I felt really confident, like, oh, I'm not Protestant anymore. Cool. Like, um, I think at a certain point in my life, I would have been freaked out by that. But now I've gotten to the place where it's like, I don't know. And that's exciting. That means there's more to uncover and more to learn. And I think with my embrace in Orthodoxy, it's helped me much more embrace mystery, which I'm very bad at. I like black and white answers. I like certainty. I like truth. But there's something about Christianity in its authentic form that is inherently mystical. And there's something about it where it's like there's always going to be things about God in the world that we just don't understand. And like how do we navigate that in the best way we can, and how do we participate in that well? Um, those are huge things that I think I've started to be more interested in the questions outside of you know, just specifically of trying to defend something or, convince myself of something.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I've spent a long time too, like trying to find certainty and like feel like I need to defend things. And it's like, this is so great, not feeling that need anymore. Like, I could get used to this.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a certain point where that has, um, what is it, deteriorating returns, where eventually, if you have nothing to ground your life in, I think for myself, when I look at my mental health and how that's been woven into all of this stuff, there's a level in which if you're living a life and you never have anywhere to ground that, you feel like you're treading water, and you feel like you're constantly swimming. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes you need to do that. And, and other times it's like, are we just kicking and tying ourselves out for no reason? And so there's a beauty in feeling some confidence, but there's also that it's a double-edged sword where that confidence itself can then become this problem and this crippling area that starts to deteriorate the foundation that you think you're standing on. And then before you know it, you're like, am I on toothpicks? What happened? So I don't know. I think for myself, and I've always said this, even when I was sort of a Christian, like I've always been a Christian, I guess, but before, when I was more Protestant and not sort of, um, I was like willing to be convinced otherwise. I respect an atheist who's willing to stand up and say what they believe, independent of what anyone thinks, versus a Christian who calls themselves that but doesn't really believe it. And there's something to embracing and celebrating the truth of like honest engagement with religion. Um, but yeah, there's also sort of a place where that definitely can become a danger too, where we start um, creating certainty in things that maybe we shouldn't be so certain in. Like it happens in both ways. And um, I'm very much learning how to be less certain. That's not a strength of me to be uncertain, but I can see the beauty in it the more that I delve into these things.
Yeah. And that's why I am not like okay, I don't call myself a Christian, but I'm not like closed off to becoming one maybe someday down the road. Like I'm not like against any of that. I'm
Right.
more open to like whatever. Yeah, there's stuff in the world that I don't understand, I can't explain, and I'm not gonna say like, oh well, I can't believe in any of that. Like I just feel like my palms open, like okay, I'm
Yeah.
open
Well, and
to
what a
whatever.
beautiful place to be. Like for the first time, you get a chance to really explore and let truth reveal itself, because I think there's the beauty of truth is it stands the test of time. And sometimes it's cloudy, but like as things go on and as life continues, y- if you're observant enough and you're seeking it, it eventually starts to show itself um, to be solid. And so how great to be able to look and see the patterns of things, and how they manifest in other people's lives, and look for the truth in them. And like there's so much about religion, when you look at it comparatively, there's a lot of things that are similar. And there's a lot of things that, you know, um, to say that just because a religion might not be completely right or the most right, that they don't have truth there, I think that's doing a
Mhm.
disservice to really understanding the world as it is. And I think that's a big thing that I've sort of realized too. There's in evangelical circles, there's a bit of a mode where we want to give you the truth, and being part of a church will be beneficial for you. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I do think church can be beneficial for non-church people, but I would rather them be welcomed in a church body, because I think church people have so much to learn from unchurched people than just us. Like, there's things we can learn from each other. And if someone doesn't feel welcome in that group, or to be around that kind of group, we're never going to be able to learn the things we need to learn from each other, which there's so much. I don't know. That's how I see it.
No, and it's true. And I feel like the only time when I was still, an evangelical Christian, the only time that like I was encouraged to make relationships with people who weren't Christians was for the purpose of convincing them to become a Christian. Like,
Yeah.
you can't just have a relationship with someone for the sake of getting to know them. It's like, no, if they don't know Jesus, there's this agenda that you actually have to have. And
Right. Which is hard, because on one end, it was like, I understand why, if you believe what you believe, especially on sort of certain evangelical strands of theology, of course you want people and love to know those things.
yeah,
Yet, on the other hand, it then becomes your job to save people, which is not compatible with this sort of view of theology that you have. And then it's like people become projects. It's not like, I'm sharing this with you because it helped me and I think it could help you too, but whatever, it's your choice. It becomes like, hey, let's be friends, and then eventually maybe you'll be receptive to something. I always sort of wanted to be like, I'm I'm friends with you independent of if you ever want to come into church or not. I think there's benefits, but that's up to you. And I do think some of the ways in which evangelical evangelicalism is practiced or marketed falls into that tricky dynamic where it's like, I don't think they mean it to sound like that or feel like that, but it does.
it does.
And that was something when I spent a lot of time with atheists and people were very antagonistic to religion, and seeing what they were seeing, it was like, oh yeah, I get that. That doesn't, I wouldn't want to be a part of that either.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I think we're running a little over an hour, but that's okay. Is there any last words or anything else you want to ask or want to talk about before we wrap up?
I was curious just like what you would say being a Christian means to you now. And that can be as like broad or as specific as you want it to be. But I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, why I call myself a Christian is because I have a trust in Jesus, and I have a trust in who he was, and I believe he was who he said he was, and he did the things that the Gospels claim that he did. Um, how do I think that should manifest in my life? I think it's a pursuit of right belief and right practice, of trying my best to believe the right things about God, of what I can know, and practice it in the way that he asks. And there's a lot of opinions on that, and I think there's a lot of people who um, are at different places and resonate different things. But for me, um, this practice of orthodoxy gets me closer to what I think historical Christianity was always supposed to be. Not to say that there, I mean, I think there may be flaws or misunderstandings, but at least for me, there's something into that draws me to it. But I don't think that if someone's not Orthodox, they're not Christian. I mean, I think there are people who are honestly pursuing God, and they're pursuing God in a genuine, honest way and trying to follow him. and they're believing in the right God, even though they wouldn't necessarily say that that is Jesus. Um, and I don't know if that's right belief or not, but for me, from what my experience is, I think there's some people who um, do believe in false gods, and we all do to an extent. We put things at the top of the hierarchy that shouldn't be, and then when we live dedicated to those things, I think it leads to a sort of death. But there are plenty of people who I've talked to who it's like they are pursuing God and trying to pursue truth, and they may even be looking at Jesus and trying to understand who he is, but they're not ready to say that's it. I mean, I still think they're following God in the right way. I don't know if I would call them a Christian, because it's such a tricky business of what do you mean by Christian. But I think for me, there has to be something where you put your trust in Jesus that distinguishes that from other types of theism. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. I'm just curious, like, since, we both come out of this evangelical Protestantism background, just, to get a different perspective on like what that means to someone that still would say that they are a Christian. I think it's cool just to like hear what that means.
Yeah. I mean, and I definitely think my concept of Christianity has changed, but like, yeah, I think at the end of the day, while I get this sort of, I don't want to call myself a Christian and I don't want the labels. It's like, but my trust is in Christ. I believe he died, rose again. I believe in um, the spiritual explanation of the Christian faith. And so I can play the semantical games, but like that to me puts me in the Christian realm. But to say that realm and how I identify as the only way you can be honestly pursuing God, um, I don't necessarily think so. I think uh, I think there's other ways you can be honestly pursuing God, and He's working with you where you're at to understand more about Him in the world. But like that's the thing, we're all on this big journey, and it's this map, and we're all trying to figure out how do we get to the top of the mountain. How do we get to the place where we have the most right belief of religion? And you've got all of these paths, and they lead different ways. And maybe there's one way to the very top, but there's all these different journeys to do that. And how do we discover if there is only one way or multiple ways? Well, there's lots of ways to do that, but like it starts with talking with people, comparing notes, and asking, "Hey, where have you been? Because I'm stuck here."
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, what does it mean to you?
What does being a Christian mean?
Yeah.
I think when you touched on the putting your trust in Jesus part, that's where I'm stuck.
Mm-hmm.
Is I I feel like my trust in God was broken just when I felt like I didn't know who he was anymore, and that's
Mm.
something that just hasn't quite recovered. Will
Yeah.
it at some point? Maybe, but
Yeah.
um yeah, it took me a while to kind of figure that out, like trust is the issue here.
Yeah.
Um
Well, and it makes sense because you've got all of these. There's a lot of religions: Islam, Mormonism, all these different denominations of Christianity, Jehovah's Witness, who claim Jesus, that they believe in different things about who Jesus was and what he was. Even within Protestant Christian denominations, there's a lot of misunderstandings about what it is. And I think for me, the first sort of crack in all of that, and it didn't make me want to run or lose trust in Jesus himself. But when I started reading the Gospels for myself, I'm like, this Jesus is very different than the Jesus I sort of been told or sold.
mhm.
And the early church looks a lot different than what I see in my community now. Why is that? And so I started sort of digging. And so when you have this belief in a counterfeit Jesus or a counterfeit religion, you feel like you're let down. Like, even if it was given to you in the most sincere way, you feel like, well, if I can't trust that, can I trust anything? And it takes some time to rebuild that and learn how to do that. And I don't, I totally understand that feeling of, losing that trust and having to figure out how to build that again. And I don't know why it was that I never lost trust in Jesus. I think, um, I think it had a lot to do with experience of seeing how my embracing of him and his teaching and like digging to really try and find out who he was changed my life. And then as I kept going and as I kept exploring, I'm realizing, oh, Jesus is breaking my categories and showing me that I don't believe in him the way he really is. And so I can be mad that I trusted this version of Jesus, but I guess the person I should be mad at is myself because I've created a false Jesus in my mind. And so the more that I've learned to like weed through some of like the truth and let those categories be broken and understand that's a good thing. Um, it's helped me move on and do those things. But I do think there's something in the experiential that was a thing that stopped me from rejecting Jesus, even though like there's times where it could have gotten really close. I remember one time I was in the middle of reading the Christopher Hitchens book, and I was lying in bed, and all of these sort of thoughts were going through my head as I'm like going through all of his arguments and trying to figure them out. And I just had this moment where I was like, well maybe he's right. And like there was just sort of this wave of fear or like doom that went over my body because it was like, if he's right, it doesn't change anything I see about the world. It just changes the hope that I have in it. And the next thing I remember is just falling asleep and waking up with the pain in my side. And I immediately start praying. And, the pain slowly subsides. And I have this thought of like, well, why am I even praying? And then, boom, a pang hits even harder. And I start praying harder. And I think that was moments like, okay, well, I still believe in God, but why? And it just, I think from there, it just sort of realized like there's something in me that's ingrained to believe in God and to want to worship, and I can't help it. Um, what does that mean? Is this a delusion? Is this something built into me and all there is space, time, and matter? Is it pointing to me something more? And if it is pointing something more, how do I determine the truth between these different religions and these different ideas of who Jesus is? And um, there's still so much that I think I've got wrong about God and Jesus, but I think that's a beautiful thing. It's like you'll never stop knowing. There's a depth to Christianity that allows you to keep pondering and asking these questions and moving forward. And I think if you're doing that in a genuine way, um, on any sort of way you start with religion, there's going to be positives from that. Um, it's learning not how to not let your ego and your own emotional baggage poison the well. I don't know, that's what I feel. But I've definitely had better moments and worse moments, and I'm just grateful for all the grace that um, non-Christians and Christians have given me as I work through this process, because I definitely engaged in the wrong ways and believed the wrong things and um, was dogmatic on things for my own selfish reasons. And um, yeah, I think it's just been a whole process of learning how to uh, explore those things better.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, I'll wrap this up, but it's been so lovely to talk with you.
Yeah, same with you.
Yeah, I'd love to talk again sometime if you're up for it.
Absolutely. Yeah, anytime.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you want to see more of what Sara has, her link's down below. But for now, I will leave you with serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.